Hi there, I'm Lindsay Chervinksy. I'm the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. And while I'm a little bit biased, I think this is my favorite part of the exhibit because it is, of course, on Washington's presidency. It ends right after the Constitutional Convention section because Washington was so essential to the creation of the Constitution. And then it takes us into what does it actually mean to be the first president when so little is actually written down in the Constitution? How do you build this institution from scratch? How do you build out the practices like what a president wears? How does a president talk to citizens? What do you call a president? What do they travel in? And how do they interact with the different branches of government? So here we're setting the scene with Washington's inauguration. I personally think that it doesn't really look like Washington, but it's always a huge fan favorite. So we have retained it. And it is a good replica of Washington's inauguration suit. So he wore a very high quality set of American homespun. So he was the first to wear American made, which I think is fabulous. And you can see it would have been a dark brown suit there. Here we have just sort of a little bit on the election and inauguration. You know, we have a one parade today, but Washington had weeks of getting to New York City, and he was feted and celebrated at every single step along the way. People would decorate bridges. Women would come out and wear white dresses. It was weeks of festivities. Then once we are actually in office, it talks about how Washington's trying to figure out what sort of things he's supposed to say as president, both in terms of avoiding some of the more monarchical traditions of the king, but also establishing our national values. And this is one of my favorite parts of Washington's story because he was so far ahead of where we think of 18th century in terms of religious freedom and religious toleration. And so he wrote this incredible letter to the oldest synagogue in the United States, in Rhode Island. And he talks in this famous quote, he says, "To bigotry, no sanction, to persecution, no assistance." And what he was saying was that it's not enough to tolerate because that leaves a religious hierarchy, but rather that all have to be welcome. And that is, I think, a message that is a timeless one. Then we head on here to Washington's national tours. Washington was quite intentional about making sure he visited every state. Although he refused to go to Rhode Island until they had ratified the Constitution, they were the last state to do so, and Washington could do petty better than almost anyone. You'll see he would go up one side of the state and then come down the other. And that was to maximize the number of people, the number of communities, the number of industries and businesses and churches that he could visit, because he wanted to have a sense of all of the different ways that one could be an American. And he also wanted to bring the federal government to the American people. At a time when they didn't really have, a sense of a national identity, they certainly didn't have ties to the federal government. And so this was a way to try and build those connections. This is a replica of one of our most prized possessions. Shortly into Washington's presidency, he ordered a copy of the Constitution and the acts of Congress passed by the first session of the first federal Congress. And as he was getting ready to give his first State of the Union, he wrote in that Constitution. He kind of was reviewing it. You can see here he has this notation next to Article 2 that says president. It's almost like, he can't Google the Constitution. He doesn't have a reference. And so he's going back and he's reading it. And next to this part where he says he shall from time to time give to Congress information on the State of the Union, he wrote required. And what we love about this is for kids is you can kind of see the different sections that light up and what they meant to Washington at that time. So this is a really fun part of the exhibit. We, of course, have Hamilton and Jefferson, because how can you not in Washington's presidency? But their battle was so much more important to Washington's presidency than I think people appreciate, because he wanted to have multiple perspectives. He wanted to know how different people thought about big issues so that he could have a lot of different perspectives and then make the best choice. So that's really about Washington's cabinet and how he thought about that. We talk a bit here about foreign policy, which was a dominating feature of Washington's presidency. France declared war on Great Britain in 1793, and he had to figure out how to keep the nation out of a global conflict because it would have absolutely destroyed the country, and we had no army and we had no navy. So even if we wanted to fight a war, that wasn't possible. And then this is our most interactive piece of the presidency. We have a recreation of what some of the molding would have looked like in the house that Washington was renting. The White House, of course, wasn't built yet. Washington was the only president never to live in the White House. And so if you come into this space, there are a number of different videos that are based actually on primary sources. So we pull actual lines from conversations we know happened, and you see different videos on the wall that are sort of depicting these moments. A dining scene with Native Americans, a drawing room with Martha Washington, and a cabinet scene. So there's different videos, there's the fireplace, and then over here, this during the cabinet scene lights up as Washington's globe. And this was the globe he would have had in his study. Also at the president's house, we know that he would have had a lot of really extraordinary furniture in the public spaces. So these are two of the chairs in the public rooms. And this is Washington's presidential chair. So this is actually the chair that he ordered for his time during the presidency. It's called the uncommon chair because it swivels and it was ergonomic for him. I have a recreation in my office, and it is very much not ergonomic for me because I'm about a foot shorter. And so my legs don't touch the feet or don't touch the ground. But it's really cool to see that space. Of course, the story of the president's house wouldn't be complete without the enslaved labor that actually worked in the house and created the dinners that Washington served to visiting dignitaries, cared for himself and the Washington family, their clothing. And so these are some of the names that perhaps people are familiar with. Hercules Posey was Washington's chef. Ona Judge was Martha Washington's enslaved maidservant. Both secured their own freedom during Washington's presidency by running away. And then lastly, no piece on Washington's presidency would be complete without the farewell address. I think that this is perhaps one of the most prescient documents in American history. Washington has two really critical warnings, both of which I think are misunderstood. So the first is that it's the warning about political parties. And Washington wasn't saying that you couldn't have political organizing. What he was saying is that we cannot allow our partisan identity to be more important than our identity as an American. The second piece is the warning against treaties. And what here he's saying is it's not an isolationist message. He's not saying that we can't have economic treaties, that we shouldn't travel, that we shouldn't engage in intellectual and economic exchange, but rather we shouldn't be dragged into wars unless it is in our best interest. And sometimes it is, but not always. And that's really his warning against permanent alliances here. But it is a remarkable document. There's a reason it's read every year in the Senate. It absolutely should be. And perhaps what makes it most impressive is it was announcing his intention to retire, which in the age of Napoleon and monarchs, it was an absolutely revolutionary thing to do to give up power. So with that, you then lead on into the final years. And of course, Washington has a very short post-presidency. So I hope you will come and see this section in particular. I think it's excellent.